Hello everyone, welcome to Full Moon Movies. When you open Eddington and you're not sure if you really walked into a western, a political drama, or a fever dream, in fact, that is the unsettled genre blur, which is exactly the point. Ari Aster has always excelled at turning intimacy into dread. Here he aims his lens at the small town crucible of a nation, and the result is less jump scare horror than corrosive social portrait. Joaquin Phoenix plays Sheriff Joe Cross like a man whose moral compass keeps losing satellites, like tired, stubborn, and convinced that authority is a muscle that must be flexed. Opposite him is Pedro Pascal's Mayor Ted Garcia, who is charisma wrapped in a technocratic promise, the shiny candidate who actually pictures a future that arrives in the shape of a data center. Well, doesn't that sound like someone we know now? Never mind, let's continue. Now, that wedge of public health, economy, hope, and tech promise salvation, those things actually splits a town and exposes how easily neighbors turn on neighbors when information is really fractured and fear is currency. This film is set in May 2020. Aster drops the pandemic and the political aftershocks into the frame not as topical bells to ring, but as the atmospheric weather of the story. Masks and mandates are not plot devices so much as social tectonics, and the quarrel over public safety is the fault line on which identity and myth actually collide. Aster stages this as a contemporary western, not a romantic one, but an anxious, brittle successor to the genre that asks, what happens to the people left on the edges when society's center fractures? The town of Eddington becomes a microcosm, the saloon that replaced by live streams, the courthouse replaced by group chats, and the frontier replaced by micro news cycles that feel like fire spreading. Phoenix's sheriff is not a classic hero. He's a man whose authority has been hollowed by a year of unpredictability. In fact, his choices are acts of clinging rather than leadership. Joaquin plays him with a kind of exhausted conviction, like the look of someone who believes his actions will be validated by history, even if history hasn't really asked his permission. Across from him is Pascal Garcia's isn't cartoon villainy. He's plausible. He sells infrastructure as salvation, promising jobs and progress, while the town's soul fractures. One who wants to conserve a version of order, the other to transform the town through modernization. It's a duel that feels less about personalities than about competing myths of what America is supposed to be. Emma Stone, Austin Butler, Michael Ward, and the rest of the ensemble populate this landscape as mirrors and echoes, family members, devotees, opportunities, and loners whose small decisions amplify into collective consequence. What Aster does well here is to resist the tidy moralizing. The film doesn't hand out badges of righteousness. People make mistakes for reasons that are plausible and pathetic and sometimes unforgivable. The result is an interrogation of the complicity rather than sermon on villainy. Critics have also noticed that the film's tonals are daring. Some hail it as a bleak, brilliant look at post-COVID America. Others call it a self-satisfied satire that overreaches. Both readings are defensible because Aster doesn't let you off the hook. Now he actually wants you to squirm in your own assumptions. Visually, Eddington opts for a clean neoclassical palette, where Midsummer was ritual drenched in daylight and Hereditary is domestic shadow. This film treats the American West as a burnt document that still glows at the edges. Darius Conji's cinematography frames wide-arrayed exteriors against sterile meeting rooms and glowing construction renderings. The feature seen as a slide deck against a landscape that remembers other histories. Aster's camera spends time in rooms with long takes that allow discomfort to accumulate until it becomes unbearable. The result is an aesthetic tension between the wide and the claustrophobic, a reminder that modernity widens vistas for some while narrowing them for others. Sound and music are crucial here. Bobby Kurlick and Daniel Pemberton, credited as co-composers, give the film a score that's both elegiac and unsettling, working as a counterpoint to the visuals rather than emotional punctuations. The sound design favors human detail, like the murmured calls on handheld radios, the scrape of campaign signposts, the hum of generators. Quiet moments feel loud because the soundtrack refuses to rescue you from the film's ethical discomfort. In fact, it amplifies the silence between characters, the things that aren't said but matters most. Aster's storytelling cadence is patient, building tension through politics and personalities rather than spectacle. There are scenes of protest and paranoia, of town halls and open private lives, but the core horror is interpersonal, what fear does to trust. Now, that pandemic context is used with force. The film shows how emergency measures, disinformation, and economic desperation becomes tools for both cynics and saints. Aster's script takes those risks. In fact, it allows for ambiguity and refuses to provide an ideological vantage point that is comfortably sympathetic. Now, that's why responses are so split. The film is intended to make everyone feel a bit little exposed. When the conflict escalates, the violence is ugly and immediate, not stylized. Aster has a gift for turning ordinary objects into instruments of dread. For example, imagine an otherwise mundane campaign caravan, its flags suddenly taking on a darker symbolism. Scenes of confrontation have the texture of real small-town messes. They are messy because real people are messy. Cinematically, the film sometimes teeters on excess, like long stretches of shimmer that some viewers may call it indulgent. But those accumulative beats pay off for those willing to engage with the film's thesis about belonging and possession. Critics have found it both bleak and brilliant, and alternatively overwrought again a movie designed to provoke an argument rather than catch it. And then there's this satire. Eddington uses the Western to cut into contemporary American identity politics. It's not merely that technology and conspiracy amplifying division. It's the film which asks how Americans have begun to fetishize narratives of ownership. For example, political, moral, historical, and how those narratives are sold as redemptive. Aster frames the data center subplot not as a technophobia but as a moral litmus test, which actually counts as progress, and who benefits when a town trades character for capital. Now, that question reverberates in the film's best scenes. For example, the intimate domestic fights, campaign rallies that feel less like democracy and more like theater, and encounters where neighbors discover that they can no longer look at one another with the same eyes. Performance-wise, Joaquin Phoenix is magnetic in ways both comforting and disturbing. He brings the kind of interior weather that makes the audience complicit in his breakdown. Pedro Pascal is the plausible merchant of hope. He sells plans like sermons. The supporting cast, especially those playing family ties and devotees to both men, gave the film the necessary social depth to feel lived in rather than schematic. Those performances are what stop the film being a mere political parable. In fact, they root it in human cost. Now, if you think where Eddington may lose viewers is in its refusal to exculpate anyone too quickly, it's not an agitprop track, but it's an uncomfortable mirror. Audiences polled by CinemaScore gave a middling average that tells you something about the film's ability to split opinions. But polarized reception was always on the cards. This is a film that works by accentuating discomfort rather than smoothing it over. For viewers whose prize tidy moral resolution, Eddington will be really frustrating. For those who want cinema to complicate their thinking, it will be provocative and disturbing in a good way. If you measure the film by cultural weight rather than box office vanity, Eddington will really matter. It's a snapshot really, messy, partisan, bleak, and of an American that feels unmoored in the 2020 and still unresolved in the present day. Ari Aster has traded ritual horror for social portraiture, and while not every note lands, many do, and when they land, they hit at the country's nervous system. For better or worse, the film is designed to keep conversations alive about identity, about progress, and about the stories of community that tells itself when it can't really agree on the facts. Now, the final image is not catharsis but implication. The town moves forward in some sense, but the social fabric has been altered. Eddington doesn't offer answers about how to stitch it back together. It only insists we look at the threads we pulled out. Now, that kind of ending, an ending that asks you to live with unease, is very much Aster's signature. Now, let's talk a bit about the Blu-ray disc. 1080p high definition, 16:9 widescreen, 1.85 inch to 1 presentation. and it has a Dolby Atmos and it's R-rated, 148 minutes with English SDH and Spanish subtitles. I didn't go for the 4K as this is a modern film which is shot in digital, and furthermore there's also Dolby Atmos. So this comes with the 6 collectible souvenir postcards as well. So the bonus features include Made in Eddington making of documentary, which is about 33 minutes. Now let's talk a bit about the artwork. Eddington's slipcover artwork is a statement on its own. Instead of the usual minimal A24 aesthetic, this one hits you with a collage of chaos. The key characters are stacked like a political war poster with neon highlighted faces overlapping each other and dead center. And you can see Joaquin Phoenix holding an automatic rifle bursting out in mid-fire. Now this is not just symbolic, it's blunt, it tells you exactly what the film is about. In fact, you can stare at this slipcover for a full minute and still find new emotional sharpnel hidden in the composition. Now, when you remove the slipcover and the standard digipack unfolds into a muted documentary-like visual language, which shows dusty streets, fallen campaign posters, and Joaquin Phoenix surrounded by wildfire in the night. In conclusion, Eddington is a film that doesn't entertain you. In fact, it confronts you. Ari Aster turns paranoia, power, and misinformation into a slow-burning psychological wildfire. From this movie, you really don't walk out with answers. In fact, you walk out exposed. Now, this movie is a must-watch.